There is a tree that can heat your home, feed your family, and heal your wounds, all three, at the same time from the same source. It requires almost no water. It grows in rocky, barren soil that nothing else will tolerate. It lives for 2,000 years. Some trees alive today were already old when the Roman Empire was founded. They kept producing through every war, every drought, every plague, every collapse of civilization around them. When the cities burned and the roads crumbled, and the supply chains that had fed millions stopped functioning overnight, the olive trees were still there, still producing, indifferent to the catastrophe. They had survived worse. For thousands of years, every family in the Mediterranean world knew exactly what this tree could do. They built their entire economy around it, their medicine cabinets, their lamps, their kitchens, their trade routes. All of it ran on one species. The tree was not a luxury, and it was not a supplement, it was the foundation. Then something happened. A civilization grew powerful enough to industrialize the tree, to take it out of the hands of ordinary families, fence it off inside enormous estates worked by slaves, and turn a universal survival resource into a commodity controlled by a small number of very wealthy men. The peasants who had once grown it freely, who had once pressed their own oil, lit their own lamps, treated their own ailments with their own leaves, were left with nothing but taxed access to what their grandparents had owned outright. And the knowledge of everything the tree could do quietly faded from common memory. Most of it has never fully come back. This is the story of the olive tree. And it is a story your grandparents understood better than almost anyone alive today. Start with what the tree actually is, because the modern world has badly undersold it. The olive tree, Olea europaea, is, by any measure, one of the most useful organisms humans have ever cultivated. It is not famous for one thing, it is famous for nothing, because modern food culture has reduced it to a bottle of cooking oil on a supermarket shelf. But strip away that reductive framing and look at what the tree actually provides in full, the way ancient civilizations understood it, and you are looking at a self-contained survival system that a family could build a life around. The oil pressed from its fruit is food. Dense, calorie-rich, stable food that does not require refrigeration, does not spoil quickly, and provides the kind of nutritional fat the human body runs on. For the working people of the ancient Mediterranean, olive oil was not a luxury condiment. It was a staple calorie source consumed in quantities we would find extraordinary today. Archaeological analysis of bones from the Roman town of Herculaneum, frozen in time by the same eruption that buried Pompeii, suggests that working-class residents were consuming roughly 20 liters of olive oil per person per year. Stop there. 20 liters per person per year. That is not drizzled on salads. That is not a condiment. At around 450 calories per daily serving, olive oil was functioning as a primary fuel source for human bodies, the way a modern person might depend on protein shakes or energy bars. But from a tree that asked nothing in return, except some rocky hillside and a few years of patience. That same oil is also lamp fuel. This matters more than it sounds. For most of human history, darkness after sunset was not an inconvenience. It was a hard limit on human productivity. If you could not light your home after dark, you lost roughly a third of your usable hours every single day. Olive oil lamps burned cleanly, with relatively little smoke, and held flames steadily enough to read by, work by, and navigate by. The difference between a household with reliable lamp oil and one without was not comfort. It was time. It was the ability to extend the productive day into the hours when the sun had gone down, to keep children learning, to keep craftspeople working, to keep records, to plan. Civilizations that ran on olive oil had functional evenings. Everyone else had darkness. And this is before we get to the part the food industry would prefer to stay quiet. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you probably already know that what your grandparents and great-grandparents understood about the natural world has been steadily edged out of common knowledge by industrial convenience. Subscribe to Traces of Time right now, because this video is one of a series, and what comes next in this pattern is going to make you genuinely angry in the most useful way possible. Now for the part that gets left out of most conversations about olive oil. The oil is not the only useful product of the tree, not even close. The leaves, Those small, narrow, grey-green leaves that most people have never thought about for a single moment contain a compound called oleuropein. Modern biochemistry has spent considerable effort studying it, and the results confirm what Mediterranean healers knew for thousands of years. Oleuropein is a potent antioxidant with documented antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. It interferes with the ability of bacteria, viruses and fungi to replicate. It supports cardiovascular function. It has demonstrated effectiveness in preliminary research against a range of infectious diseases. But here is where it gets strange. Researchers analyzing extra virgin olive oil found a compound called oleocanthal. They noticed something they did not expect. Oleocanthal inhibits the exact same biological enzymes as ibuprofen, not similar enzymes, the same ones, working through the same molecular pathway, at comparable concentrations. What that means is this. Every time a Mediterranean grandmother rubbed olive oil on an inflamed joint or gave a spoonful to a child with a fever, she was delivering a natural anti-inflammatory that operates on the same biochemical mechanism as one of the most widely sold pharmaceutical drugs on the planet. She did not know the mechanism. She did not need to. She had 6,000 years of results. Hippocrates, the figure the entire Western medical tradition names as its founding father, documented more than 60 medicinal uses for olive oil and its derivatives. 60, recorded in detail. That is not a folk remedy passed down around a fire. That is a comprehensive medical system assembled by the most rigorous clinical mind of the ancient world, applied to a single species based on outcomes he observed directly in patients. He used it for skin conditions, digestive disorders, wound care, inflammation, fever management, and as a base for compound preparations that addressed dozens of other ailments. The Roman physician Galen, whose influence on medical practice lasted for more than 1,000 years, created topical preparations using olive oil as a primary ingredient. He recognized its antiseptic properties, its ability to form a protective barrier over damaged skin, and its value as a vehicle for delivering other medicinal substances to the body. Avicenna, Ibn Sina, the 11th century Islamic physician whose canon of medicine synthesized centuries of Greek and Arabic medical knowledge, wrote specifically about olive oil's ability to support digestion, treat respiratory problems, address joint pain and fever, and, remarkably, what he described as a calming effect on the nervous system, useful in conditions we would today recognize as anxiety. The same leaves that produced that oil were brewed as tea to reduce fever. They were applied as poultices to wounds. They were used to treat what ancient practitioners described as conditions of the blood, what we might now recognize as high blood pressure and elevated blood sugar. 19th century medical records from European pharmacies documented olive leaf decoctions specifically for fever management, noting the presence of a bitter compound they could not yet name. The compound was oleuropein. The tradition they were preserving was several thousand years old. The wood of the tree, dense and hard, burned slowly and hot. The waste material from pressing, the pomace, the residue left after the oil was extracted, burned at high temperature, cleanly, for longer than charcoal. Nothing went to waste. The liquid byproduct of extraction, the amurca, dark, bitter, pungent, was used by the Romans as a pesticide for insects and weeds, as a waterproofing agent for leather and wood, as a lubricant for axles and machinery, as a fertilizer, and as a topical treatment for wounds and skin conditions. Even the thing most people would throw away was a functional product with documented uses. One tree, every part used, nothing wasted. Take a moment to think about what it would mean to have that growing in your back garden right now. Not one use, not two. All of them, simultaneously, from a tree that asks almost nothing of you in return and will be there for your grandchildren's grandchildren. Think about what your great-grandparents would have made of the fact that most people alive today have never thought about this at all. Leave a comment below. Did your grandparents or great-grandparents have an olive tree? Did they know how to use more parts of it than just the fruit? Tell me where your family comes from and what they knew. I want to hear it. Now here is where the story turns, because everything described above, every use, every function, every gram of knowledge accumulated over 6,000 years of cultivation, was understood, documented, and practiced across the entire Mediterranean world. From the Canaanite coast, where the earliest olive presses have been found, dating back to 6,000 years before the current era, to Minoan Crete, where palace records tracked oil distribution the way a modern government tracks fuel reserves, to classical Athens, where the olive tree was considered so sacred that destroying one was punishable by exile or death. Moses, according to historical record, specifically exempted olive tree growers from military service, not farmers, not craftsmen, olive tree growers, because the tree was too important to lose even one season of productivity. It took 15 years for a newly planted tree to reach full production. The knowledge of how to care for it, how to press it, how to use every part of it, was community capital that could not simply be replaced. This was not superstition. This was a civilization correctly identifying a resource so valuable that its management had to be protected by law. And then the Romans came. The Romans were not ignorant of what the olive tree could do. They were the opposite. They understood it completely. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, declared that Italy had the finest olive oil in the Mediterranean at the most reasonable prices. He was not wrong. The Romans had developed olive cultivation to an industrial level that the ancient world had never seen before. They planted groves across North Africa, Spain, Syria, and the Levant. They built enormous stone presses that could process harvests at scale. They shipped oil in amphorae across the entire empire on a logistics network that remains impressive even by modern standards. They understood the tree so well that they turned it into a political instrument. Under Emperor Septimius Severus, the Roman state introduced a formal program, Oleum Publicum, providing free olive oil to Roman citizens, not as charity, as political control. The ability to distribute or withhold oil was power. The ability to set prices, to determine access, to decide who pressed their own and who depended on the state, was leverage that the senatorial class wielded with extraordinary precision across several centuries. And this is where ordinary people disappeared from the story. As Rome expanded its military, peasant farmers, the people who had grown and managed their own small olive groves for generations, were conscripted and sent to fight wars for longer and longer periods. Their farms could not sustain themselves during these absences. Many fell into debt, many were forced to sell, and the buyers were senators and wealthy equestrians who had both the capital and the political connections to acquire land that the law was supposed to limit but never effectively did. Small family farms became latifundia, enormous slave-worked estates, so rapidly that Pliny the Elder declared that the latifundia had ruined Italy. Not metaphorically. He meant it as a statement of fact about what had been lost. The peasant families who had grown their own oil, lit their own homes, treated their own ailments with their own leaves, were now landless workers in Roman cities, dependent on state distributions for the very resource their grandparents had produced themselves. The knowledge did not disappear overnight, but it stopped being transmitted. When you do not grow the tree, you do not learn the tree. When you do not press the oil yourself, you do not understand what the pressing does. When the leaf is not in your garden, it is not in your pharmacy. Within a few generations, the comprehensive knowledge, the 60 uses of Hippocrates, the full spectrum from leaf to wood to America to oil, had contracted into a single use case. Cooking, maybe a lamp. The rest was gone from common memory. No one ordered it erased. The system did it automatically. What survived and where it survived tells you something important about how knowledge persists through the collapse of the systems that produced it. When the Roman Empire fell, the latifundia collapsed with it. The elaborate distribution network stopped functioning. The senatorial class lost its ability to maintain the estates at scale. And olive cultivation, the knowledge of it, the practice of it, would have vanished almost entirely from large parts of Europe if it had not been preserved in one specific place. Monasteries, the medieval monastic tradition, for all its complications, did something that nothing else in the early medieval period managed to do. It maintained working olive groves and kept the associated knowledge alive. Monks maintained the trees, pressed the oil, used it for medicine, for lamp fuel in church interiors, for wound care, for the sacramental anointing that Christianity had inherited from the same ancient tradition that understood the tree's healing properties. The monastic pharmacy preserved what the Roman system of latifundia had stripped from ordinary families, and it is worth pausing on that for a moment because the mechanism is important. The monks who maintained olive groves in early medieval Italy or southern France did not do so because they had read the same texts as Hippocrates or Galen, though some of them had. They maintained the practice because the practice had utility they could observe directly. The oil worked. The leaves reduced fever. The wounds healed faster. The lamps burned well. Practical outcomes do not need theoretical frameworks to survive. They need practitioners who observe them, repeat them, and teach them to the next person. This is exactly how knowledge survived in grandparents' generations for centuries before the modern era, not through books, through direct observation and practical transmission. Your great-grandmother did not have a biochemistry degree. She had 30 years of watching what happened when she used the oil on a wound versus when she did not. She had her mother's instruction and her grandmother's instruction before that. She had a chain of empirical practice stretching back through the medieval monastery, through the Roman household before the latifundia took it away, all the way to the Neolithic women who pressed the first wild olives at sites along the Carmel coast 6,000 years ago. The chain broke not because the knowledge stopped working. It broke because the systems that transmitted it were replaced by systems that had no economic interest in transmitting it. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. Industrialization extracts a resource from the hands of the people who understood it most intimately, scales it for profit, loses the surrounding knowledge in the process, and a small community of practitioners, usually religious, sometimes scholarly, occasionally just stubborn, keeps the full picture alive until the world is ready to pay attention again. The world, in this case, started paying attention again in the mid-20th century. Researchers studying the Mediterranean diet noticed something that did not fit the models they were working with. Populations in Italy, Greece, and Spain, populations consuming substantial quantities of olive oil as a dietary staple, were showing significantly lower rates of cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, and neurodegenerative disorders than populations on other dietary patterns. The initial assumption was that the data was being collected incorrectly. The data kept insisting it was right. Scientists started looking more closely at what olive oil actually contains at a molecular level, expecting to find a simple story about fat composition. What they found was not simple at all. It was not a surprise to anyone who had read Hippocrates carefully, but it was a profound surprise to a medical establishment that had, for most of the 20th century, treated the idea of food as medicine, as folk superstition, to be politely dismissed. The olive oil that Mediterranean grandmothers had been rubbing on joints and feeding to sick children for 60 generations was doing something measurable, repeatable, and explainable at the molecular level. The science had finally caught up to the kitchen. If this video gave you something that most people walking around today genuinely don't know, and I think it did, the like button is how you tell me this kind of content is worth making more of. It takes less than a second, and it matters more than you might think. Here is what the modern food industry did with this information. Extra virgin olive oil, the cold-pressed, unrefined, highest quality oil that retains the full polyphenol content responsible for its therapeutic effects, is expensive to produce. It requires careful harvest timing, immediate processing to prevent oxidation, and the kind of small-scale attention to quality that does not scale efficiently to industrial production. So the industry created a workaround. The oil sold in most supermarkets as simply olive oil, not extra virgin, not cold-pressed, just olive oil, is a refined product. The refining process removes much of the polyphenol content. It also removes much of the flavor, which is why refined olive oil tastes bland. The people who designed that process knew what they were removing. They removed it because what remained was cheaper to produce, had a longer stable shelf life, and was easier to move through large retail chains at high volume. No one needed to conspire to make this happen. The system did it on its own, the same way the Roman latifundia didn't need to plan the erasure of peasant knowledge. Economic gravity pulls in one direction. Profit concentrates. Knowledge disperses. The result is the same whether anyone intended it or not. Your grandparents, if they came from any Mediterranean tradition, knew which oil to use. They did not buy refined oil for medicine. They kept extra virgin olive oil, the real thing, from trees they often knew personally, pressed at mills they could visit, for the uses that required the full spectrum of the tree's properties. They used it on wounds. They gave it to children with coughs. They applied it to dry or damaged skin. They consumed it in quantities that modern nutritionists would consider excessive, and that apparently produced extraordinary health outcomes, given that the same Mediterranean populations had some of the longest life expectancies and lowest chronic disease rates recorded in 20th century epidemiological studies. The knowledge they carried was not mysterious. It was not spiritual. It was accumulated empirical observation, refined across 6,000 years of close attention to one tree. And it was, once again, being narrowed down by the system into a single use case. Here is what you can recover right now from the tree your grandparents understood. Before the practical steps, consider what just happened in the last few centuries to knowledge that humans accumulated over 6,000 years. The 19th century was the period when the industrial food system began to develop in earnest. Canning, refining, processing, mass distribution, all of these changed not just how food was produced, but how people thought about it. Before industrialization, food knowledge was local knowledge. A family in Andalusia knew the specific character of their specific grove on their specific hillside. They could tell the difference between oil pressed from early harvest green olives and oil pressed from fully ripe black olives, not as an abstract preference, but as a practical distinction, with implications for flavor, for shelf life, for specific therapeutic uses. They knew that the green olive oil, sharper, more bitter, higher in polyphenols, was the one you kept for wounds and illness. The riper oil was for cooking. These were not opinions. They were the accumulated observations of multiple generations of close attention. By the mid-20th century, most of that knowledge had contracted to olive oil goes in salad dressing, not because people became less intelligent, because the chain of transmission was broken. Industrial distribution meant you no longer knew the grove. You no longer knew the harvest timing. You no longer knew what you were buying, because the product had been stripped of the context that made its properties legible. Your grandparents, in the regions where this tree was native, were in many cases the last generation who still carried the full picture. The last generation who would have immediately known that olive leaf tea and a warm compress was the first response to a fever. The last generation who would have automatically reached for the good oil, the real thing, the fresh-pressed extra virgin, rather than a pharmaceutical preparation for a wound that needed protecting. The gap between what they knew and what most people know today is not scientific progress, it is loss. And the astonishing thing is that the tree is still there. The knowledge is still recoverable. Now for what you can actually do with this information today. 3 practical steps, each one recovering something your grandparents' generation considered too basic to explain. The polyphenol content that does the real work. The content that reduces inflammation, that supports cardiovascular function, that provides the antimicrobial action Hippocrates documented across 60 ailments, is present in meaningful quantities only in unrefined, cold-pressed extra virgin oil. Everything labeled simply olive oil on a supermarket shelf has been through a refining process that strips most of that out. The refining makes it cheaper, more shelf-stable, and milder in flavor. It also makes it functionally different from what your grandparents kept in their kitchen. Pay attention to the harvest date on the bottle, not just the best before date. Extra virgin olive oil is a fresh product, not a shelf-stable commodity. An oil pressed 18 months ago and stored in clear glass in a warm supermarket has lost a significant portion of its polyphenol content before you even open it, regardless of what the label says. The best producers stamp the harvest date clearly and package in dark glass. Buy the freshest available. Spend more if necessary. You are not buying cooking fat. You are buying a 6,000-year-old medicine that happens to make your food taste better at the same time. Second, the leaves. Olive leaf tea has been used to reduce fever for thousands of years, and modern research on Oleuropein has confirmed the mechanism. 1 to 2 teaspoons of dried olive leaves steeped for 10 minutes in just boiled water produces a drink that is bitter and functional. Mediterranean herbalists have used it for fever, for respiratory infection, for immune support, and for the kind of chronic, low-grade inflammation that modern populations experience at epidemic rates and treat, at considerable expense, with pharmaceuticals that produce side effects the olive leaf does not. The 19th century Pharmacopoeia, the formal record of medicinal substances used by trained apothecaries, documented olive leaf decoctions specifically for fever management. This was not fringe practice. It was recorded in the same books as the treatments physicians were actively prescribing to patients. When the pharmaceutical industry developed synthetic alternatives in the early 20th century, the olive leaf was not replaced by something more effective. It was replaced by something more profitable. If you are fortunate enough to have access to an olive tree, your own, a neighbor's, one in a park or garden, the leaves are not ornamental. They never were. They are the part of the tree that most people alive today have walked past without a second thought, having lost the knowledge that explains why every ancient civilization that lived near olive trees considered the leaves worth careful attention. If you've tried olive leaf tea before, or if your family used olive leaves for anything at all, I genuinely want to know. Drop it in the comments below. These are the details that get lost between generations and that this channel exists to preserve. Tell me what your grandmother knew. Third, the understanding of what extra virgin actually means and why the modern food system works hard to confuse you about it. There is currently no universally enforced standard for the phrase extra virgin on olive oil labels in most markets. Tests conducted on oil sold as extra virgin have regularly found products that do not meet the chemical criteria for that designation. Refined oils blended with small quantities of genuine extra virgin oil to provide enough flavor for plausibility. The price point is usually the tell. Genuine high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil from a specific region with a verifiable harvest date costs more than most supermarket product. If you are buying olive oil at a price that seems surprisingly reasonable, it is not extra virgin in any meaningful sense. Your grandparents in the regions where the olive tree was grown did not have this problem. They knew the tree. They knew the mill. They knew the season and the press. The oil was not anonymous. It was not a product divorced from its source. It was the output of a relationship with a specific landscape and a specific set of trees that might have been producing for a century before anyone living had been born. The industrialization of food, the same process that the Roman latifundia began, that the modern food system has perfected, does not just change how food is produced. It changes the relationship between the person who eats and the thing that feeds them. It converts knowledge into ignorance. It turns active management of your own nutrition and health into passive consumption of products whose full properties you are not informed about. The tree that started this story is still there. Some of the individual trees that the ancient Greeks grew on terraced hillsides above the Aegean are still alive, still producing. The olive tree of Vouvs in Crete has been dated to somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years old. It still bears fruit. The oil pressed from its olives is still edible, still therapeutic, still carrying the same molecular properties that Hippocrates documented more than 2 millennia ago. The tree did not forget anything. We forgot the tree. Deliberately, systematically, profitably, we forgot the tree, and that is a choice we can still reverse. There is something in that worth sitting with for a moment. We live in a time of extraordinary access to information, more written knowledge than any previous civilization has ever had access to, available to anyone with a screen and a connection. And we managed, through the accumulated effect of industrialization and commercial convenience, to lose practical knowledge that was common property for 6,000 years. The Romans did not invent that process. They accelerated it. Every system of industrial consolidation since has continued it. The grandparents' generation, the one that this channel keeps coming back to in this series and in others, represents in many cases the last point at which this knowledge was still widely held, still practically applied, still transmitted through direct family instruction rather than through a documentary you have to actively seek out. Which is, perhaps, one reason you are here, Most people will watch this and move on. They'll go back to their supermarket shelf and pick up the bottle that says olive oil without reading the label. They'll walk past the olive tree in the park without a second thought. Don't be one of them. Share this video with someone who grew up near olive trees and never thought about the leaves. Share it with someone who is paying a pharmaceutical price for an anti-inflammatory effect that grows on a tree and has been free or nearly free for 6,000 years. And if this series has been useful to you, the series on the things your grandparents understood that the modern world forgot, subscribe to Traces of Time right now, because every video in this series is recovering one more piece of knowledge that should never have needed recovering in the first place. The tree is still there, the knowledge is still available. It just takes someone willing to look.